November 26, 1943, 23,000 feet above the German border. The FW-190 rolls into position, its pilot already grinning behind his oxygen mask. Below him, lumbering through the thin air like a pregnant cow, comes the American fighter. Massive, ungainly, absurdly fat, the P-47 Thunderbolt. He'd heard about these things. 7 tons of metal trying to pretend it's a fighter. The Luftwaffe pilots have a nickname for it already. Der Klotz, the log. He pushes the stick forward, beginning his dive. Easy kill. The American probably can't even see him yet, too busy wrestling that barn door through the sky. His fingers curl around the trigger. Range closes. 500 meters. 400. Then the American turns. Not a gentle banking turn, a snap roll that shouldn't be possible for something that size. The Thunderbolt's nose comes around like the fist of God, and suddenly the German is staring into 8 black holes arranged in a perfect arc across those wings. The 500 calibers open fire. The sound reaches him before the rounds do, a tearing, thunderous roar that drowns out his own engine. His cockpit explodes in a hurricane of steel and shattered plexiglass. He's not laughing anymore. The summer of 1940 belonged to the Luftwaffe. Over the fields of France, above the beaches of Dunkirk, through the skies of Britain itself, German fighters carved trails of victory that seemed unstoppable. The Bf-109E, sleek, fast, deadly, had established air superiority across an entire continent. Its pilots were veterans, bloodied in Spain, Poland, and the Low Countries. They flew with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and the kill marks on their fuselages gave them every right to it. The British Spitfire could match the 109E in a dogfight, but only over home territory. The Hurricane was tough, but outclassed. And the Americans? In 1940, they were still flying pursuit aircraft that would have looked outdated in 1936. The P-40 Warhawk could fight, but it couldn't climb with the 109. The P-39 Airacobra was a designer's fever dream that tumbled out of the sky if you looked at it wrong. The P-38 Lightning showed promise, but it was complex, expensive, and wouldn't arrive in numbers for years. By 1942, the strategic situation had crystallized into a brutal mathematical problem. The United States 8th Air Force was preparing to bring the war to Germany itself. Waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators that would strike at the industrial heart of the Reich. But there was a fatal gap in the plan. The bombers could reach Berlin. Their escorts could not. The Spitfire had the range of a dragonfly. From bases in England, it could barely reach the French coast before its fuel gauges started screaming for home. The Hurricane had the legs, but not the numbers, and its Allison engines had an unfortunate habit of freezing solid at 30,000 feet over Germany. Every bomber crew knew the drill. Fighters would shepherd them to the enemy coast, waggle their wings in apology, then turn back. After that, you were alone with the flak and the Focke-Wulfs. The losses were staggering. On October 14, 1943, during the second raid on Schweinfurt's ball bearing factories, the 8th Air Force sent 291 bombers into Germany. 60 didn't come back. 600 men gone in an afternoon. The crews started calling these missions maximum effort raids, but among themselves, they used a different term: suicide runs. The doctrine of the self-defending bomber formation was dying in the skies over Europe, drowning in its own blood. The Boeing engineers had promised that massed 50-caliber defensive fire would turn bomber formations into flying fortresses indeed, untouchable, invulnerable. The Luftwaffe proved them catastrophically wrong. A determined German pilot could slice through a box formation, absorb punishment that would kill 3 lesser aircraft, and still send a fortress tumbling earthward with its wings on fire. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the U.S. Army Air Forces, faced a strategic crisis. Without fighter escort deep into Germany, the daytime bombing campaign would grind to a halt. Without the bombing campaign, the invasion of Europe would be infinitely more costly, perhaps impossible. The fighters existed, the P-47, the P-51, but in late 1942, neither had proven they could do what doctrine demanded. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been born from a requirements document that asked for everything and accepted no compromises. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, had looked at the specifications and made a decision that would define the entire program. He would build the fighter around the largest, most powerful engine America could produce, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, an engine so massive it had previously been reserved for bombers. Everything else followed from that single choice. To handle the torque of that enormous engine, the fuselage had to be huge. To keep the propeller from striking the ground, the landing gear had to be absurdly long. To feed the engine at altitude, it needed a turbocharger the size of a beer keg. To house the turbocharger, the rear fuselage swelled into a distinctive barrel shape. To make use of all that power, Kartveli decided the aircraft would carry 8 .5 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, more than any fighter in the world. When the first XP-47B rolled out of the factory in 1941, test pilots looked at it and wondered if someone was playing a joke. It weighed 12,500 pounds empty. A Spitfire weighed 5,100 pounds. The Thunderbolt wasn't just heavy for a fighter, it was heavier than some light bombers. Critics called it the 7-ton milk jug. Republic called it the Thunderbolt. The pilots would call it the Jug, and the name stuck like mud on boots. The skepticism wasn't limited to appearances. Early combat reports from the Pacific, where P-47s arrived in late 1942, were mixed at best. The Thunderbolt could dive like a bullet and absorb punishment that would disintegrate a Zero, but it couldn't turn with the nimble Japanese fighters. Army Air Force generals looked at the loss rates and wondered if they'd invested in the wrong horse. But Europe was a different war. The Luftwaffe didn't fight like the Japanese. German pilots didn't throw their aircraft into desperate turning battles at low altitude. They fought with energy tactics, diving attacks from high altitude, using speed and surprise, then climbing back up to safety. The Bf-109 and FW-190 were superb energy fighters, and their pilots were taught to use altitude like a bank account, spending it in lethal diving attacks, then climbing back to reload. The P-47 was built for exactly that kind of fighting. Its massive weight, so crippling in a turning battle, became an asset in a dive. Gravity loved the Thunderbolt. In a steep descent, it could hit speeds approaching 550 miles per hour, faster than anything the Luftwaffe could field. And that R2800 engine, gulping air through its turbocharger, produced full power all the way up to 30,000 feet, where German engines gasped and wheezed. The first P-47C models arrived in England in December 1942. Assigned to the 56th Fighter Group, the Wolfpack, and the 4th Fighter Group, the Debden Eagles. The pilots approached their new mounts with a mixture of curiosity and dread. They'd been trained in Spitfires, sleek and responsive as a sports car. The Thunderbolt felt like climbing into a locomotive. Captain Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group took one look at the massive fighter and reportedly said, "It's a monster, but I'll fly anything with wings and a gun." The early missions were learning experiences, written in blood and adrenaline. On April 8, 1943, the 4th Fighter Group flew its first P-47 escort mission to the German coast. They met FW-190s over the Dutch lowlands. The German pilots, seeing the enormous American fighters for the first time, dove to attack with the same tactics that had been slaughtering Allied fighters for 3 years. They were in for a surprise. The P-47s didn't try to turn with them. They couldn't, but when the Focke-Wulfs pulled up to climb back to altitude, expecting the Americans to be left wallowing below, the Thunderbolts stayed right with them. That R-2800 kept pulling, kept clawing for altitude, kept the Americans in the fight. And once a Thunderbolt got on your tail, those 850 cals made survival a matter of seconds. Still, the Germans weren't impressed. Not yet. The early kill ratios were roughly even, and Luftwaffe fighter pilots noticed that the P-47s always had to turn back at the German border. Without drop tanks, the Thunderbolt's combat radius was barely 175 miles. They could reach the coast, fight for a few minutes, then race home with fuel gauges showing vapor. The bombers still flew alone into Germany, and they still died in flames over Wilhelmshaven, Emden, and Kiel. German intelligence officers studied gun camera footage and pilot reports. Their assessment was clinically precise. The P-47 was dangerous in a dive, but could be avoided with proper altitude management. It was heavily armed, but too large to be truly agile. Most importantly, it couldn't reach the interior of the Reich. Luftwaffe fighter controllers developed tactics to simply wait out the American escorts, then pounce on the bombers once the P-47s turned for home. In late May 1943, the Luftwaffe's assessment seemed justified. During a raid on Kiel, P-47s turned back at the German border as expected. Minutes later, FW-190s and Bf-109s swarmed the bomber stream. 11 B-17s went down. The escorts hadn't failed. They'd simply run out of sky to operate in. But Republic Aviation and the Army Air Forces were already working the problem. Engineers designed ferry tanks, large external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when empty or when combat started. By June 1943, P-47s began flying with a single 200-gallon belly tank. Range jumped to 375 miles. By August, they were carrying 108-gallon tanks on underwing pylons as well. The Thunderbolt, that supposedly short-legged milk jug, could now reach Frankfurt and fight its way home. The Luftwaffe didn't know it yet, but the laughter was about to die in their throats. The fighters they'd dismissed as clumsy giants were about to penetrate deep into the Reich, and they were coming with enough firepower to tear the sky apart. The learning curve was over. The killing was about to begin. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson climbed into his P-47 on June 26, 1943. With 27 missions under his belt and a growing reputation as one of the 56th Fighter Group's most aggressive pilots. He was 22 years old. That afternoon, he would learn exactly what the Thunderbolt could survive. Over the French coast, his flight encountered a formation of FW-190s. Johnson dove on one, got strikes, but in his tunnel vision lost sight of the enemy leader. The Focke-Wulf's cannon shells hit like hammering fists. His windscreen exploded. His engine cowling peeled back. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit, blinding him with red mist. Cannon rounds punched through the fuselage behind his seat, 3 feet from his spine. He should have been dead. Any other Allied fighter would have come apart under that punishment. The Thunderbolt kept flying. Johnson couldn't bail out. His canopy was jammed. He couldn't dive away. His controls were barely responding. So he did the only thing left. He pointed the nose down and pushed the throttle to the firewall. The Thunderbolt dove like a thrown anvil, accelerating through 500 miles per hour. The Focke-Wulf tried to follow, but couldn't match the speed. Johnson crossed the channel at 50 feet, his aircraft trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid, and put it down in a dead stick landing at his base in England. Ground crews counted 21 cannon strikes and more than 200 machine gun hits. The armor plate behind Johnson's seat had stopped 3 20-millimeter shells. The R-2800 engine, despite having half its cowling shot away, had run perfectly all the way home. Johnson climbed out, kissed the fuselage, and told his crew chief, "Don't ever let anyone tell you the jug can't take it." That survivability changed everything about how American pilots fought. In a Spitfire, you learned to be elegant, dancing at the edge of the envelope, never taking unnecessary risks. In a P-47, you could be brutal. You could charge into a formation of German fighters with the confidence that your aircraft could absorb punishment and still bring you home. It wasn't invulnerable, but it was close enough that pilots fought with an aggression that shocked the Luftwaffe. The learning curve wasn't just about surviving, though. It was about killing. The P-47's 8 50-caliber Brownings were mounted 4 to each wing, converging at a point 300 yards ahead of the aircraft. When all 8 guns fired together, they produced a combined rate of fire exceeding 100 rounds per second. The sound inside the cockpit was like standing inside a kettle drum while someone beat it with sledgehammers. Major Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, drilled his pilots on gunnery until they could shoot in their sleep. He emphasized the one advantage the P-47 held over every German fighter: overwhelming firepower. A Bf-109 carried one 20mm cannon and two machine guns. An FW-190 carried four 20mm cannons and two machine guns. Both were deadly, but their ammunition was limited, usually enough for 6 to 8 seconds of firing. The P-47 carried 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, enough for 30 seconds of sustained fire. In a dogfight, 30 seconds was eternity. You could miss, adjust, fire again, miss again, and still have ammunition left to tear your target apart. German pilots who survived encounters with P-47s reported the same thing: an endless stream of tracers, bullets that came in waves, fire that seemed to never stop. The M2 Browning .5 caliber machine gun was already legendary by 1943. John Browning had designed it in the aftermath of World War I, and it had spent 2 decades being refined into one of the most reliable weapons ever created. Belt-fed, air-cooled, capable of firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds at 800 rounds per minute, it was the perfect aircraft weapon. Republic Aviation mounted 8 of them in the P-47's wings, 4 per side, staggered to fit within the wing's depth. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. The ammunition belts added another 200 pounds per gun. The total weight of the armament system, guns, ammunition, feed systems, and blast tubes, exceeded 1,500 pounds. The Thunderbolt didn't carry weapons, it was built around them. The killing pattern was devastating. Each .5 caliber round was a half-inch diameter bullet weighing nearly 2 ounces, traveling at 2,900 feet per second. Armor-piercing rounds could punch through half an inch of steel at 500 yards. Incendiary rounds ignited fuel tanks and hydraulic lines. When 8 guns converged on a target, the combined kinetic energy was equivalent to throwing a small car at 300 miles per hour. German aircraft structure couldn't handle it. The Bf-109's wing spars were aluminum alloy, strong but light. A 2-second burst from a P-47 would saw a wing clean off. The FW-190 was more robust, with heavier frame construction, but even it would come apart under sustained fire. Luftwaffe pilots learned to fear the moment when those 8 guns locked onto them. There was no armor thick enough, no evasive maneuver fast enough. But the guns were only half the marvel. The real genius was the engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp was a masterpiece of American engineering. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each row forming a perfect circle. It displaced 2,800 cubic inches, hence the designation. At full power, it produced 2,000 horsepower while weighing 2,360 pounds. The power-to-weight ratio was extraordinary for its time. What made it revolutionary, though, was the turbocharger system. At sea level, air is dense and rich with oxygen. At 30,000 feet, it's thin as a dying breath. Normal engines lose power as they climb. A naturally aspirated engine loses roughly 3% of its power for every 1,000 feet of altitude. By the time you reach 30,000 feet, you've lost nearly all your power. The P-47's turbocharger changed the equation. Exhaust gases spun a turbine at 21,000 RPM, compressing incoming air and forcing it into the engine. The result was an engine that produced nearly full power even at altitudes where other fighters gasped. A Bf-109G made 1,475 horsepower at sea level, only 1,250 at 30,000 feet. The P-47 made 2,000 horsepower at sea level and 1,900 at 30,000 feet. This gave American pilots an advantage that couldn't be overcome with skill alone. They owned the high ground. In any battle, the P-47s could climb above the Germans and attack from altitude. Energy fighting, the art of converting altitude into speed and speed back into altitude, was the dominant tactical doctrine of the air war. The Thunderbolt was built for it. Major General William Kepner took command of 8th Fighter Command in August 1943 and immediately began rewriting the tactical playbook. The old doctrine, stay close to the bombers, never leave the formation, don't pursue German fighters, was getting American pilots killed without significantly reducing bomber losses. Kepner wanted his fighters to hunt. He issued a directive that would change the air war. The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters, not to escort bombers, to kill the Luftwaffe. The bombers would be safer if there were no German fighters left to attack them. It was obvious in hindsight, but it required a fundamental shift in how fighter pilots thought about their mission. The P-47 groups embraced it immediately. Zemke's 56th Fighter Group pioneered the bounce and zoom tactic. Cruise at maximum altitude, dive on German formations from above, make one firing pass at tremendous speed, then zoom back up to altitude using the momentum from the dive. Never turn, never slow down. Hit and climb, hit and climb. German pilots found themselves facing an impossible dilemma. If they climbed to engage the P-47s, they surrendered their energy advantage and became targets. If they stayed low, the P-47s dove on them with a speed advantage that made evasion nearly impossible. If they tried to run, the Thunderbolt's superior high-altitude performance meant it could chase them down in a stern chase. The only effective counter was to catch a P-47 in a turning fight at low altitude, where the Bf-109 and Fw-190 superior agility gave them the edge. But experienced P-47 pilots never took that bait. They'd simply extend out of the turn using their superior straight-line speed, then climb back to altitude and reset the engagement on their terms. By autumn 1943, the learning curve had flattened out. The early combat losses, caused by inexperience, poor tactics, and mechanical issues, had been paid in full. Now the accounts were coming due for the Luftwaffe. The P-47 groups had learned how to fight in their aircraft, and they were hungry for payback. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke of JG-11 wrote in his diary in April 1943, "The Americans have sent us a gift, giant fighters too heavy to maneuver and too slow to catch us. Our tactics remain sound." By December 1943, his diary entries had changed in tone. "The Thunderbolts are everywhere now. They climb like homesick angels and dive like stones from hell. When they open fire, it is not guns, but entire batteries. The sound alone is enough to shatter one's nerves." The psychological impact of the P-47's firepower cannot be overstated. Luftwaffe pilots were accustomed to the brief hammering of cannon fire, violent but short-lived. The endless stream of 50 caliber tracers was something else entirely. It created the illusion that you were being shot at by a dozen aircraft at once. Pilots reported seeing rivers of fire and walls of tracers in their combat reports. More demoralizing was the Thunderbolt's armor and survivability. German pilots were taught to aim for critical components: the engine, the cockpit, the fuel tanks. With British and early American fighters, this was effective. A good burst into the engine cowling would set a Spitfire or Hurricane aflame. The same burst into a P-47 might blow holes in the cowling, shatter the propeller, and punch through cooling lines, and the aircraft would keep flying. Hauptmann Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, an ace with 176 victories, described engaging a P-47 over northern France. "I put 3 cannon shells directly into his engine. I saw the strikes. He should have been finished. Instead, he simply rolled inverted and dove away, and I could not follow." His speed in the dive exceeded anything I could achieve. I returned to base and wrote in my report that the American fighter is essentially an armored attack aircraft masquerading as a fighter. It is not fragile. It does not die easily. The R-2800 engine proved nearly impossible to kill with a single pass. Its 18 cylinders meant that even if several were destroyed, the remaining cylinders could keep the engine running. The oil system had multiple redundancies. The cooling system could sustain significant damage and still function. Pilots reported hitting P-47s with multiple cannon rounds, seeing pieces fly off, watching smoke pour from the engine, and then watching the Thunderbolt simply fly away. By late 1943, Luftwaffe briefings included specific warnings about engaging P-47s. Recommended tactics emphasized attacking only when you held a significant altitude advantage, making a single high-speed pass and breaking away immediately. Prolonged engagement was discouraged. Turning fights were forbidden. Some German pilots developed a bitter respect for the aircraft. Others refused to engage them unless no other option existed. A few simply lied in their reports, claiming mechanical issues rather than admitting they'd broken off combat with Thunderbolts. The aircraft that had been mocked as a flying barrel had become something to fear. Before the P-47's extended range made deep penetration possible, the Luftwaffe operated from a position of strategic comfort. Fighter controllers could vector interceptors to predicted bomber routes, knowing that American escorts would turn back at the border. The interior of Germany was safe haven, a vast training ground where new pilots could practice tactics on unescorted bombers before facing Allied fighters. The introduction of drop tanks shattered that comfort. By September 1943, P-47s equipped with 108-gallon wing tanks could reach targets 340 miles from their bases. By November, improved 150-gallon tanks pushed the radius to 425 miles. Frankfurt, Stuttgart, even Munich came within range. Suddenly, there was no safe haven. The Americans could reach anywhere, and their fighters came with them. This forced a fundamental change in Luftwaffe defensive strategy. Previously, fighters could be concentrated at a few key bases near the coast, scrambling to intercept bombers as they came in. Now fighters had to be dispersed across hundreds of airfields throughout Germany, Austria, and occupied territories. The alert time shrank from hours to minutes. Pilots who had expected to intercept bombers over France found themselves scrambling to defend their own airfields. The strain on the German fighter force was immense. Each mission now required launching from dispersed bases, climbing to altitude, forming up into formations, then engaging not only bombers but escorts that outnumbered them. Fuel consumption skyrocketed. Accidents during hasty scrambles increased. Pilot fatigue became chronic. The numbers tell the story. In January 1943, before P-47s began flying escort in strength, the 8th Air Force lost 5.1% of its bombers per mission, sustainable but painful. By October 1943, with P-47s reaching deep into Germany, the loss rate had dropped to 3.8%. More importantly, the bomber formations were reaching their targets intact and delivering their payloads with devastating accuracy. The unescorted formations scattered and bombed blind. The escorted formations stayed together and hit what they aimed at. German industrial production began to suffer, not from the bombing alone, but from the combination of bombing and the inability to defend against it effectively. Factories weren't destroyed in single raids. They were worn down by repeated attacks that arrived on schedule, escorted by fighters that made interception costly and dangerous. In early 1944, someone in 8th Fighter Command asked a dangerous question. What else could the P-47 do? It was already the best high-altitude escort fighter in the European theater, but it was also tough, heavily armed, and capable of carrying external stores. What if, after escorting bombers to the target and fighting off interceptors, the P-47s went looking for ground targets on the way home? The first experiments were informal, pilots strafing trains and trucks opportunistically. The results were promising. The 8.50 calibers that could tear apart aircraft proved equally effective against locomotives, fuel trucks, and staff cars. The P-47's rugged construction meant it could fly through ground fire that would shred lighter fighters. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, ground attack had become a formal secondary mission. P-47s would escort bombers into Germany, engage enemy fighters, then descend to low altitude and strafe anything that moved on the way home. They carried the new M10 3-tube rocket launchers, 3 5-inch rockets per rack, 2 racks per wing, for 6 rockets total. Each rocket could penetrate 4 inches of armor. The tactics were brutally simple: dive from altitude, pick up speed, line up on the target, fire rockets at 1,000 yards, follow through with .50 caliber fire, then pull up hard and climb back to safety. If ground fire got too heavy, you simply added power and outran it. The P-47 could take hits that would down any other fighter and still make it home. German armored columns learned to fear the sound of the R-2800 engine. A Thunderbolt on a strafing run was moving at 400 miles per hour, closing at 600 feet per second. By the time you heard it, it was already firing. The .50 caliber rounds couldn't penetrate heavy tank armor from the front, but they could shred half-tracks, fuel trucks, command vehicles, and exposed infantry. The rockets could knock out medium tanks and destroy armored cars outright. After the Normandy breakout, P-47s of the 9th Air Force transitioned almost entirely to ground attack work. They roamed over France in squadron-strength formations, hunting for German vehicles, trains, and troops. The kill counts became legendary. Entire convoys destroyed, rail yards paralyzed, retreat routes turned into killing grounds. But the 8th Air Force P-47s maintained their primary mission: escort and air superiority. They would take the bombers to Berlin and back, kill any German fighter foolish enough to rise and meet them, and only then descend to strafe targets of opportunity. The Thunderbolt had become both shield and sword, protecting the bombers, killing the defenders, and destroying the infrastructure that kept Germany fighting. February 20th, 1944. Big week begins. The weather had been terrible for days, dense overcast blanketing Europe from the Channel to Poland. Bomber missions scrubbed, fighters grounded, the air war suspended by clouds that refused to lift. But on the morning of the 20th, the meteorologists saw a break coming. A window, maybe 5 days, maybe a week, when the skies over Germany would be clear enough for visual bombing. General Jimmy Doolittle, newly appointed commander of the 8th Air Force, made the decision. They would fly every mission possible, hit every aircraft factory they could reach, and break the Luftwaffe's back in a single coordinated campaign. It was ambitious. It was desperate. It might be the last chance to win air superiority before the invasion of France. The P-47 groups launched from their bases in England at dawn. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, the 4th Fighter Group, the Debden Eagles, the 78th, the 353rd, the 352nd, all climbing through the morning mist into the clearing sky. They carried 150-gallon drop tanks and full ammunition loads. The plan was simple: take the bombers all the way to the targets deep in Germany, kill everything that rose to stop them, and bring everyone home. Over Holland, they met the first German fighters, a staffel of Bf-109Gs climbing to intercept the bomber stream. The P-47s dove from 30,000 feet, drop tanks already jettisoned, 8 guns hot and ready. The Germans never reached the bombers. 3 Messerschmitts went down in the first pass, victims of snapshots fired by pilots who had learned to shoot while diving at 450 miles per hour. The kill was almost clinical. No drawn-out turning fight, no dramatic aerobatics. just the brutal application of speed, altitude, and overwhelming firepower. The surviving 109s broke and dove for the deck. The P-47s let them go. The bombers came first and climbed back to altitude to resume escort position. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin of the 56th Fighter Group was leading a flight of 4 Thunderbolts at 32,000 feet when he spotted a formation of FW-190s setting up for a beam attack on the B-17s below. He didn't radio, didn't need to. He simply rolled inverted and pulled through into a vertical dive. His wingmen followed. At that altitude, in that dive, the P-47s hit speeds approaching 550 miles per hour. The Focke-Wulfs never saw them coming. Mahurin opened fire at 400 yards, a long shot, but at his closure rate, he'd be past the target in 2 heartbeats. His tracers walked up the fuselage of the lead 190 and converged on the cockpit. The German fighter's canopy shattered, the pilot slumped forward, and the aircraft rolled onto its back and fell away. Mahurin's wingman took the number 2. The element leader took the number 3. In 6 seconds, 3 Focke-Wulfs were destroyed and a 4th was trailing smoke and diving away. The formation never reached the bombers. This happened a dozen times that day. 24, across the entire length of the bomber stream, from the Dutch coast to the targets around Leipzig. P-47s intercepted German fighters before they could reach the bombers. The Luftwaffe fought back with everything it had. Pilots flew 3, sometimes 4 missions per day, scrambling from hastily repaired airfields, climbing through American fighter screens, pressing attacks despite losses that would have broken any other air force. They killed bombers, 73 over 6 days, but they couldn't stop the missions, couldn't turn the bombers back, couldn't break the escort screen that now reached all the way to the targets. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, leading the 61st Fighter Squadron out of Halesworth, shot down 3 German fighters on February 22nd. His tactic was textbook Thunderbolt. Cruise at 33,000 feet, wait for German fighters to form up for their attack run, dive on them from directly above. The Germans never saw him until his guns opened fire. By the time they reacted, he was already climbing back to altitude, and his wingmen were diving in behind him. By February 25, the Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots at a rate it couldn't sustain. Replacement pilots were arriving at frontline squadrons with as little as 30 hours in type, barely enough to take off and land safely, let alone fight American pilots who had hundreds of hours and dozens of missions under their belts. The veteran Experten, the aces who had learned their trade in the Battle of Britain and over Russia, were still dangerous, but there weren't enough of them anymore. Major Heinz Baer of JG-1, an ace with over 200 victories, wrote after a mission on February 24, "We are being bled to death, not by lack of courage or poor tactics, but by mathematics. They have more fighters, more pilots, more fuel, more ammunition. Each day we lose pilots we cannot replace. Each day their skill increases while ours diminishes. The Americans have learned to fight in their heavy fighters, and now they fight very well indeed." The psychological effect on German pilots was crushing. Previously, they had fought bombers, large, slow targets that couldn't maneuver and relied on formation discipline for survival. Dangerous, yes, but predictable. Now they had to fight through a screen of fighters that outnumbered them, outclimbed them at altitude, outdove them in speed, and outgunned them in firepower. And even if you got through the escorts, even if you made your attack run on the bombers, you had to fight your way back out through the same screen of P-47s. D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, and the Luftwaffe barely showed up. The Allied invasion force included over 5,000 ships and 150,000 men landing on 5 beaches in Normandy. The planners had anticipated heavy aerial opposition, dive bombers attacking the landing craft, fighters strafing the beaches, medium bombers hitting the naval forces offshore. They allocated massive resources to air defense, dozens of fighter squadrons on continuous patrol, naval anti-aircraft batteries, even barrage balloons over the fleet. The Luftwaffe flew fewer than 300 sorties over the invasion beaches on D-Day. Most of those were reconnaissance flights. The fighter bombers that did appear were intercepted and destroyed before they could reach the beaches. P-47s of the 9th Air Force flew 1,873 sorties on June 6th alone, providing an umbrella of air superiority so complete that Allied soldiers later reported they never saw a German aircraft all day. The contrast with previous amphibious operations was stunning. At Salerno in Italy, 9 months earlier, the Luftwaffe had mounted hundreds of sorties per day, sinking ships and causing significant casualties. At Anzio, German aircraft had harassed the beachhead for weeks. At Normandy, they were simply absent, not because they lacked the will to fight, but because they lacked the capability to survive. The campaign of attrition that began with Big Week had worked. The Luftwaffe had lost not just aircraft, but pilots, the irreplaceable core of experienced flyers who knew how to survive in combat and teach others to do the same. The replacement pilots arriving at squadrons in the spring of 1944 were dying at rates approaching 80% in their first 5 missions. They had the courage, but not the skill, and courage alone couldn't overcome the mathematical reality of being outnumbered 5-to-1 by fighters that were faster, tougher, and better armed. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, the pilot who had survived 21 cannon strikes over France in 1943, ended his combat tour on May 8, 1944, with 27 confirmed aerial victories. He was the first American pilot in Europe to break Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories. Every single one of his kills had been scored in a P-47. When asked by reporters what made the Thunderbolt special, he said, "It brings you home. That's what makes it special. You can fight in it knowing that if you make a mistake, if you take hits, you'll probably survive. That confidence changes everything." By July 1944, the 8th Air Force's P-47 groups were operating with near impunity over Germany. The standard mission profile had evolved into something the Germans couldn't counter: escort bombers to the target at high altitude, maintain air superiority during the bombing run, then descend to medium altitude and strafe targets of opportunity on their way home. The Germans couldn't stop the high-altitude phase because the P-47s owned the space above 25,000 feet. They couldn't stop the strafing phase because by then the German fighters had already been engaged and scattered. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolf Pack, became the highest-scoring American fighter group in the European theater with 674.5 confirmed aerial victories by war's end. The 4th Fighter Group finished with 583 confirmed victories. Between them, just 2 P-47 groups accounted for more kills than the entire Luftwaffe achieved against 8th Air Force heavy bombers in the last year of the war. Individual aces emerged with scores that rivaled the Experten: Francis Gabreski with 28 confirmed kills, Robert S. Johnson with 27, Walker Mehuren with 24.25 victories. These weren't inflated claims or padded numbers. Each victory was confirmed by gun camera footage, witness statements, and often wreckage examination. The P-47 pilots had learned to be surgical in their kills: short bursts, precise deflection shooting, disciplined fire control. The Luftwaffe's final gamble came in late 1944 with the introduction of the Me-262 jet fighter. At 540 miles per hour in level flight, it was 100 miles per hour faster than a P-47 at the same altitude. Its 4 30mm cannons could destroy a bomber with a single burst. In theory, it should have changed the air war. In practice, it barely mattered. The Me-262 was fast but short-ranged, mechanically unreliable, and required long runways that made its bases obvious targets. P-47s couldn't catch the jets in the air, but they didn't need to. They simply waited near the known Me-262 bases and caught the jets during takeoff or landing when they were slow, vulnerable, and couldn't maneuver. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group shot down an Me-262 on August 5, 1944, by positioning himself over the jet's base and diving on it as it tried to land. The jet was fast. It wasn't immortal. By the end of 1944, the strategic situation was mathematically irreversible. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over its own territory and could not regain it. German pilot training programs were graduating pilots with less than 40 hours of flight time, sending them into combat against Americans with 300 hours and 30 missions of experience. It wasn't a fight. It was a slaughter conducted at 25,000 feet by men who had learned to kill efficiently and without mercy. The Thunderbolt hadn't won the air war alone. The P-41 Mustang deserves equal credit for its role in long-range escort and air superiority. But the P-47 had done something equally important. It had proven that American engineering philosophy prioritized survivability, firepower, and brute performance over elegance could produce a weapon that changed the strategic balance of the war. The Germans had laughed at the fat American fighter. By 1945, there weren't enough German pilots left alive to laugh at anything. The final accounting was written in numbers that still shock. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew 546,000 combat sorties in the European theater, more than any other American fighter. Its pilots were credited with 3,752 confirmed aerial victories against Luftwaffe aircraft, second only to the P-51 Mustang's 4,950 kills. But the Thunderbolt statistics tell a deeper story when you examine the context. It achieved those kills while operating primarily as a bomber escort and ground attack aircraft, not a dedicated air superiority fighter. The loss rate tells the real tale. Of the 15,636 P-47s delivered to combat units, 3,499 were lost in combat, a loss rate of 22.4%. Compare this to the P-38 Lightning's 28.7% loss rate, or the P-51 Mustang's 23.8% loss rate. The Thunderbolt's survivability wasn't just reputation, it was statistical fact. More importantly, pilot survival rates in P-47s were significantly higher than in other fighters. When a P-47 was hit, the pilot had a much better chance of making it home or at least surviving to become a prisoner of war. Colonel Hubert Zemke's 56th Fighter Group flew 447 missions and lost 128 aircraft in combat, but they shot down 674.5 enemy aircraft for a kill ratio of 5.27 to 1. This ratio improved over time as pilot experience increased. In the first 6 months of operations, the group's kill ratio was roughly 2 to 1. By mid-1944, it had climbed to nearly 8 to 1. The Germans weren't getting worse, the Americans were getting better, and they were doing it in an aircraft that let them survive their early mistakes. German pilot accounts from the post-war period consistently emphasize two aspects of fighting P-47s: the firepower and the ruggedness. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, commander of Luftwaffe fighter forces, wrote in his memoirs, "The American Thunderbolt was not the most dangerous enemy fighter in terms of performance, but it was perhaps the most demoralizing. You could shoot it, hit it repeatedly, watch pieces fly off, and it would continue to fight. This had a psychological effect on our pilots that is difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore." The effect on bomber crews was equally significant. Before the P-47s arrived with extended range, bomber crews approached each mission with the grim acceptance that they would be alone over Germany, and some percentage would not return. After mid-1944, bomber crews flew with the confidence that fighters would be with them all the way to the target and back. Morale improved. Mission effectiveness increased. Bomb accuracy went up because formations stayed together instead of scattering under fighter attack. The 8th Air Force's loss rate per mission dropped from an unsustainable 5 to 6% in late 1943 to under 2% by mid-1944. This wasn't solely due to P-47 escort. Improved tactics, better defensive armament, and P-51 Mustangs all contributed. But the P-47's ability to reach deep into Germany starting in late 1943 was the inflection point. Before that, the daylight bombing campaign was on the verge of being suspended as unsustainable. After that, it became the sledgehammer that helped break Germany's industrial capacity. Ground attack statistics are even more striking. After D-Day, P-47s operating in the ground attack role destroyed 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. These numbers come from post-war analysis of German transportation records and represent verified destruction, not just claims. The impact on German logistics was catastrophic. Armies couldn't be reinforced. Supplies didn't reach the front. Retreating units were caught on the roads and destroyed. The human cost of this effectiveness was borne by the P-47 pilots flying low-level strafing missions. Ground fire was intense, accurate, and deadly. While the Thunderbolt could absorb tremendous punishment, it wasn't invincible. Flak batteries with quad 20mm guns could pump out enough shells to saturate an area. A single hit in the wrong place, the oil cooler, the hydraulic lines, the pilot, could bring down even a Thunderbolt. Of the 3,499 P-47s lost in combat in Europe, roughly 2,600 were lost to ground fire during strafing and ground attack missions. This represented a calculated trade, accepting fighter losses to destroy ground targets that would otherwise kill Allied ground troops. The pilots knew the mathematics. They flew the missions anyway. The legacy of the P-47 extended far beyond the European theater. In the Pacific, Thunderbolts flew from bases in New Guinea, the Philippines, and eventually Okinawa, supporting MacArthur's island-hopping campaign. The aircraft that couldn't turn with a zero proved ideal for the long-range escort and ground attack missions required in the Pacific. Its ruggedness was even more valuable in the jungle. P-47s operated from primitive airstrips, absorbed damage from ground fire during low-level attacks on Japanese positions, and brought pilots home, despite battle damage that would have downed lighter fighters. The 348th Fighter Group, operating P-47s in the Pacific, claimed 330 aerial victories and destroyed thousands of ground targets. Their tactics mirrored those developed in Europe. Use altitude and speed, never turn with the enemy, rely on firepower and survivability. Japanese pilots found the Thunderbolt just as frustrating as the Germans had. You couldn't kill it cleanly, and if you tried to engage it on its terms, those 850 calibers would tear you apart. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey examined the impact of the Allied fighter campaign on German war production and military capability. The conclusions were stark. The attrition of Luftwaffe fighters and pilots between February and June 1944 was the decisive factor in achieving air superiority over Europe. Without that air superiority, the D-Day invasion would have been vastly more costly and might have failed entirely. The P-47 was a primary instrument of that attrition. While the P-51 Mustang gets more attention for its range and performance, and deservedly so, the Thunderbolt was there first, broke the Luftwaffe's back during Big Week, and proved that American pilots could not just survive, but dominate in the skies over Germany. The Mustang benefited from the foundation the Thunderbolt laid. Tactics developed, lessons learned, Luftwaffe strength already broken. 15 American P-47 pilots became aces in a day, scoring 5 or more victories in a single mission. Francis Gabreski flew 166 combat missions in P-47s before being shot down by ground fire while strafing in July 1944. He survived, evaded capture for several days, and was eventually taken prisoner. He ended the war with 28 confirmed kills, all in Thunderbolts. After the war, he returned to service, flew F-86 Sabres in Korea, and added 6.5 more kills to his total. But he always maintained that the P-47 was the finest fighter he ever flew. Robert S. Johnson never flew combat again after his tour ended in May 1944. He had survived his wounds, survived being shot to pieces over France, survived dozens of missions into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. He returned to the United States, toured factories as a hero, and told workers that their aircraft were bringing American pilots home alive. He meant every word. The Thunderbolt remained in frontline service with the U.S. Army Air Forces until 1949, serving with occupation forces in Germany and Japan. It equipped Air National Guard units well into the 1950s. Foreign air forces operated it even longer. Peru flew P-47s until 1966, making it one of the longest-serving fighter aircraft in aviation history. The aircraft that German pilots had mocked as too big, too heavy, too clumsy had proven to be one of the most effective fighter aircraft of World War II. It wasn't the fastest or the most maneuverable. It didn't have the range of the P-51 or the climb rate of later model Spitfires, but it had something more important. It brought pilots home, it destroyed everything it fought, and it changed the strategic balance of the air war at the critical moment when that balance needed changing. The Mockery had died in the skies over Germany, along with thousands of Luftwaffe pilots who learned too late that the Thunderbolt wasn't a joke. It was a sledgehammer wrapped in wings, and it hit with the force of American industrial might and the skill of pilots who had learned to wield it with deadly precision. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become synonymous with American air power. It represented a philosophy: build it strong, arm it heavily, give it the power to dominate, and train the pilots to use those advantages without mercy. The Germans had learned to fear the sound of the R-2800 engine and the thunder of 8 50-caliber guns firing in unison. The statistics, the kill ratios, the mission counts, all of these tell part of the story. But the full story is written in the survival rates, in the pilots who came home when they shouldn't have, in the missions that succeeded because the escorts were there, in the ground targets destroyed, and in the Luftwaffe's inability to stop any of it. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't win the war alone. No weapon system ever does. But it was there at the critical moments, flown by men who learned to master its quirks and exploit its strengths, and it helped turn the tide when the tide needed turning. That is its legacy, and it is enough. There is a photograph taken in the summer of 1945 of a P-47 Thunderbolt sitting on a grass airfield in England. The war is over. The guns are cold. The propeller is still. On the fuselage, someone has painted 97 small swastikas, each one representing an enemy aircraft destroyed. Below them, a name, Hairless Joe, and below that, in smaller letters, "She always brought us home." That sentence captures something essential about what the Thunderbolt meant to the men who flew it. It wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't an elegant machine that pilots dreamed of flying. It was 7 tons of aluminum, steel, and firepower that did exactly what it was designed to do: fight, survive, and return. The German pilots who laughed in 1943 were responding to appearances. And in warfare, appearances can be deceiving. They saw an aircraft that violated every principle of fighter design they had been taught. It was too heavy, too large, too brutish. What they failed to see was that American engineers had built a weapon for a different kind of war. Not the war of 1940, where nimble fighters dueled over France, but the war of 1944, where survival, firepower, and range determined who controlled the sky. The transformation from mockery to mastery took less than 2 years. In that time, American pilots learned to fight in an aircraft that demanded new tactics, new thinking, and absolute confidence in its ability to absorb punishment. They learned that you didn't dogfight in a Thunderbolt, you dominated. You climbed higher, dove faster, hit harder, and accepted that if something hit you back, you would probably survive. The cost was paid in full by both sides. German pilots died learning that the fat American fighter was more dangerous than it looked. American pilots died learning how to use their aircraft's strengths and avoid its weaknesses. But by the time the learning curve flattened, the balance had shifted irreversibly. The Luftwaffe never recovered from the attrition of 1944, and the Thunderbolt was one of the primary instruments of that attrition. Wars are won by many factors: strategy, logistics, leadership, industrial capacity, and the courage of individual soldiers. But sometimes, a weapon emerges that changes the calculus, that makes possible what was previously impossible. The P-47 Thunderbolt was such a weapon. It gave American bomber crews the protection they desperately needed. It gave fighter pilots a mount that could survive their mistakes and capitalize on their skills. It gave ground troops close air support that could destroy enemy armor and cut supply lines. And it did all of this while looking like something that should never have worked. Too big, too heavy, too brutish. The joke was on anyone who underestimated it. The Germans laughed in 1943. By 1945, there was nothing left to laugh about. The sky belonged to the Thunderbolt, and the 8 guns that had seemed like overkill had proven to be exactly enough. In the end, the P-47's legacy is written not in records or statistics, but in the men who climbed out of shot-up cockpits, kissed the fuselage, and whispered thanks to the Republic engineers who had built them a fighter that refused to die. That is what the Thunderbolt meant. That is what it will always mean. She always brought them home.